Welcome in everyone for another deep dive. It's going to be a fascinating one today. We're really diving deep into a whole life with this memoir as time goes by. And it's less of a straight up biography, more a reflection on, well, everything really. Memory, prejudice, love, even searching for meaning. It's all there. You guys requested this one, so let's get into it.
What's really striking is how the author uses specific moments, like snapshots from his life, to explore these huge themes. It's not just a timeline of events, it's like we're right there with him, feeling the emotional and unphilosophical journey woven through it.
Yeah, and right away we're hit with this incredibly vivid image, a photograph dated 1933 of a 3-year-old boy, all smiles, sitting on a rocking horse. But, and this is where it gets interesting, as you read the description, there's this underlying sadness.
Almost like a foreshadowing.
Exactly, like a premonition of something heavier to come. He even points out the cheap-looking horse, the grainy, almost faded quality of the picture itself.
Innocence, especially at that age, exists in such a fragile bubble. And in this story, that bubble's about to burst.
Uh-huh.
Not long after this idyllic photo, the narrator and his family are driving, and they come across a scene that, well, it sears itself into his memory, a lynching.
It's chilling, the way he describes it, the way his parents react, or rather, don't react. That heavy silence in the car, you can practically feel the tension.
And this is where the deep dive truly begins, right? It's one thing to witness something so horrifying, but to be that young, he's grappling with the horror, but also the confusing messages he's getting from his family about what it means.
Especially that justification for slavery from his uncle. I mean, what a messed up thing to tell a kid.
It speaks to the complexity of the time and the way these prejudices were often passed down through generations.
Thankfully, the grandfather steps in with a very different perspective, and it's clear he leaves a mark on the narrator.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the grandfather is described as a hedonistic sinner, someone who, enjoys life's pleasures, even the ones some might consider, well, bad. But despite this label, he becomes a source of creativity and joy for his grandson.
It's like that classic saying, don't judge a book by its cover. This guy who, as some people's standards might be considered immoral, forms this strong bond with his grandson over art, over movies, heck, even sharing a sip of whiskey.
Precisely. It really challenges our assumptions about people and reminds us that influence can come from the most unexpected places. The narrator starts with fear, but it gives way to this unexpected bond. That speaks volumes, I think, about the power of human connection, seeking that connection beyond societal labels.
It really makes you wonder how often we might write people off based on preconceived notions? And this experience early on really sets the stage for the narrator's constant questioning of societal norms throughout his life.
Yeah, as he gets older, those questions, those societal norms, they really start hitting closer to home, especially when it comes to his own identity.
Right, like in that episode with Bill, his friend, and well, let's just say suggestive flip books. The memoir handles it well, though. It's a sensitive topic.
Definitely. And it's not gratuitous. The focus stays on the narrator's confusion more than anything. And that sense of betrayal, too. It's like he's trying to process not only what happened, but what it means, especially as he's figuring out who he is.
You really get that feeling, like this experience, awkward as it is, almost acts as a catalyst for him.
Totally. It pushes him, even if he doesn't realize it at the time, toward this understanding that love, attraction, desire, it's complicated. There's
Hmm.
so many shades of gray.
So much nuance, yeah. It's funny, though, because right after this introspective part, we meet Ted, and Ted's like the poster child for throwing the rule book out the window.
Right.
That anecdote, I love this one about him ordering a hound dog without nuts at the ice cream parlor. Just classic Ted.
It's so small, that detail, but I don't know, it sums him up perfectly. The guy is a nonconformist, plain and simple, not afraid to challenge anything, even if it's just how you order your ice cream. And that fearlessness, well, it leads to some pretty wild stuff, like that train hopping incident.
Which, let me tell you, terrifying just reading about it. Clinging to the side of a moving train. Are you kidding? You really get a sense of the danger they put themselves in.
Talk about risk taking, right? And it makes you think about, I don't know, the different ways people approach life, especially at that age. Are you Team Ted, diving headfirst into everything, or are you more cautious, like the narrator?
Or maybe, like you said, a bit of both, depending on the day. But even with their differences, their friendship, it seems to stick, at least for a while.
It does, yeah.
And speaking of relationships, we can't forget Grace, the unrequited crush, the unattainable. It's almost painful to read about his attempts to get her attention, like watching a really awkward play, you know?
Those fumbled attempts at romance, they're so universal, aren't they? Everyone's been there at some point.
Yeah.
You just want to give the younger version of him some advice, you know?
Exactly. But you can't because we've all been there. And Grace, even though they never actually get together, she still represents something, that intensity, that longing for connection that just screams adolescence.
And it's interesting, right? Because the memoir doesn't even really focus on whether or not he gets her in the end.
Yeah.
It's more about those raw emotions
Mm.
and how they shape who you become internally
Mhm.
more than any external outcome.
And shaping who you are internally, that's a perfect segue into college. Because for him, it was a turning point. He goes from the struggling student to suddenly an aspiring writer. What a transformation. Makes you think about the impact just one person, the right professor, the right mentor can have on a life.
Right. Talk about finding your passion, the
Yeah.
thing that just ignites your mind and makes you want to devour knowledge, create something new. For him, it was literature.
And he's not just reading in a vacuum either. This is the early 50s, the Korean War is happening, and you see these anxieties, the big picture anxieties, they actually start to filter into his personal life, like in those arguments he has with Ted about the war.
It's a good reminder, isn't it? Even in a personal story like this, history is always present in the background. Their views on the war, it reflects this larger division that's happening in society as a whole. It gets you thinking. How do those external events end up shaping our beliefs, our relationships?
And just as things are heating up on an intellectual front, he gets thrown into a whole different kind of battlefield, a battleship, in fact. His time in the Navy on the USS Mississippi, that's a whole other chapter.
Totally different world, yeah. What's fascinating is he goes from hating it, the structure, the being away from home, the whole thing, to kind of grudgingly respecting the experience.
It's like he's forced to confront his own preconceived notions about what it means to be in the Navy, right?
Wow.
Especially on this aging battleship. He even comes to, I don't know, appreciate the history, the legacy embodied in the ship itself.
There's a parallel there, isn't there? The ship is this old, almost irrelevant thing.
Yeah.
But then you get closer and you see the battles it's weathered, the stories etched into it.
Oh, and speaking of stories, the anecdotes from this time period. Come on, pure gold. That one where he accidentally clocks a decorated pilot with a flashlight, I swear I was laughing out loud.
Oh yeah, that one's classic. But it shows something else too, just how naive he was at that point in his life, which again plays into that whole don't judge a book by its cover thing.
Totally, just like with his grandfather.
Okay.
But okay, it's not all slapstick humor in the Navy. There's romance, too. Diana enters the picture, the jazz-loving whirlwind.
Ah, yes, Diana.
And for a bit, it really does feel like he stumbled into a classic love story. Dancing, passion, those late-night adventures. But even as he's swept away, you get this sense of, I don't know, almost like a disillusionment creeping in.
Yeah, there's this feeling he's chasing something that might not last.
Yeah.
Almost like a premonition of what's to come.
And that premonition, it becomes reality in Spain. He goes there, chasing after this dream, this whole romanticized idea of Spain, fueled by his love for all things Spanish. But it's also an escape, right? Like he's trying to outrun this failing marriage.
It's a classic move, isn't it? When life gets tough, we hop on a plane, hoping a change of scenery will magically fix everything. The allure of elsewhere, it's powerful.
Yeah.
But as the memoir shows, sometimes you just end up, bringing your baggage along with you.
And for him, that baggage leads to a pretty painful divorce. And the memoir doesn't get into the nitty-gritty details or anything, but you feel it, the emotional weight of it all. It's like this reminder that even when you're exploring new cultures, chasing passions, life has a way of, throwing those curveballs.
Absolutely. But it's interesting, right? Because those moments when we stumble, when things fall apart, that's often where the real growth happens. That trip to Spain, even though it starts as this escape, it becomes this journey inward. He's forced to confront those parts of himself he'd been trying to avoid.
And out of that process, out of that self-discovery, he finds Connie. And their love, it's different, quieter somehow. There's this real sense of partnership, of mutual respect.
A shared love of adventure, too, which is important.
Oh, for sure. But like you said earlier, life it likes to keep things interesting, right? The narrator, he faces those cancer battles and then eventually loses Connie. This is where the memoir really sits with you. It makes you think about your own experiences with loss, with grief.
Yeah, those heavy hitters. It's a reminder, isn't it, that life is both precious and fragile, that we don't have as much control as we think we do. But even in the sadness, there's this sense of, I don't know, maybe acceptance. like making peace with the things you can't change.
And finding those small moments of grace. I'm thinking of that part where he talks about the song On the Good Ship Lollipop, this seemingly insignificant memory, but it transports him back to his childhood, unlocks all these emotions.
It's amazing how music can do that. It's like a
Yeah.
direct line to those visceral memories, the ones we might not even realize we're carrying.
For sure. And then there's that encounter with the coyote and the opossum. On the surface, just a moment in nature, right?
Uh,
But for the narrator, it sparks this whole reflection on perception, on empathy, even.
Totally. He talks about how we go through life, often seeing things only from our own limited perspective, making judgments about other people, other creatures even, without really trying to understand them.
He even applies it to his own life, questioning his past actions, the judgments he made. It's this reminder that we're all works in progress, always evolving. And sometimes facing our own mortality, that can be the biggest catalyst for growth.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, can we talk about that MRI scene for a second?
Hilarious.
Oh my gosh, yes. The claustrophobia, the sheer panic, he nails that feeling of being trapped.
Hmm.
But underneath the humor, there's that deeper fear too, right? Of what they might find, that fear of mortality we all have to grapple with at some point.
So relatable, though. And ultimately, the memoir, it leaves us with more questions than answers. What does it mean to live a good life? How do we reconcile those regrets, those what ifs, with accepting how things turned out? And I love that he doesn't try to give us easy answers.
It's more powerful that way. He leaves us with that unfinished quote, "The greatest thing in the world is." It's like an invitation, isn't it? To fill in the blank for ourselves.
Absolutely. And what a perfect note to wrap up this deep dive. We've gone on quite a journey through a whole life, really, a life well lived. And it reminds us that it's not just about the big events, the successes, even those romantic moments we talk about. It's about paying attention to all of it, finding meaning in the everyday moments, in the connections we make, the lessons we learn, even the heartbreaks. This memoir, it's not just a story, it's an invitation to really examine our own lives, you
Yeah.
know? And that's something worth thinking about. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.